We're gonna go ahead and get started. I didn't know. Oh well. I have a slideshow, it doesn't matter. Yeah, you have to like go in and add it, and it's just complicated to do. So. But no, it's gotta be like it's complicated. All right, we're gonna go ahead and get started. If you would like to open this morning to Job chapter 1. Job chapter 1. All right. I see. There's. Amy's helping me out back there, so. All right, Job chapter 1. I'll start calling them by name. There's, oh, Jimmy walked away. He doesn't want to be called by name. All right, we're going to get started. It's mostly the lust. That's who it is. now she's patting Steve, so. All right, if you'd like to open to Job chapter 1, we are switching tracks this morning. And so as a part of this curriculum that through most of the year we do on Wednesday nights, but during the summer, because of the series we're doing on Sunday mornings, that we are keeping track with all the other classes, the kids, and that they're doing back there. That gives us then the opportunity to go home or to talk to people of a different age, even if they're not in our home, about their Bible classes, and we've all kind of studied the same thing, which even in my own house I've seen has been a very beneficial and good thing. We're following that curriculum, and so last week Johnny looked at Genesis 9 and 10, and we're actually going to pick up there for half a second at Johnny's request, and then we're going to jump forward to Job chapter 1. And so if you want to go back to Genesis chapter 9 for just a second, we're going to discuss one short thing just to kind of clarify something last week, and then we're gonna move forward, and we're gonna spend 3 weeks in Job starting this week. But if you remember last week, if you were here, we were studying Genesis chapter 9, and I thought Johnny did a tremendous job explaining this. It's not even something that I had thought of before, but it's the most biblically sound argument that I've heard as to what this means in Genesis chapter 9 and verse 23. And it has, so many of the arguments about what Genesis 9:23 means have a lot of holes in them, but I really can't poke very many in this one. It says Genesis 9:23, but Shem, or really we're in verse, 22. Genesis 9:22, Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and went backward and covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. And so Johnny did a really tremendous job taking us to a different part of the Bible that helps us to explain, pointing out that Moses is the writer of both Leviticus and Genesis. And so when he uses that word nakedness, and it is, I went back and looked later, it's the same word in the Hebrew, both instances. When he uses that word, it has a very specific definition. He showed us Leviticus 18, but this week he had asked me to point you to Leviticus 20. He said he had this in his notes and he just skipped right over it on accident, but that it does make it a little bit clearer if you look in Leviticus 20 and verse 11. Leviticus 20 and verse 11 as a definition of what it means, what Moses means when he says a father's nakedness. Leviticus 20 and verse 11 says, "The man who lies with his father's wife has uncovered his father's nakedness." And so it gives us that different definition. This is the second time. It also does it in Leviticus 18. But here it makes it very plain. The definition of your father's nakedness is lying with your father's wife. And the consequence by the time of the law of Moses, now Genesis happens before the law of Moses, but by the time of Moses, the consequence is that both of them shall surely be put to death, and their blood shall be upon them. And so that maybe, if you were a little confused last week, he had forgotten to point out this verse, which makes it a little bit more obvious what exactly happened between Ham and his father. And then we're going to jump to Job chapter 1 on that note. But any thoughts or comments on that before we move on?
Are you saying that Cain played with his mother?
Not Cain, Ham.
Ham.
Yes, that's what we're saying.
There's
Yes.
nothing implementing that there.
I'm sorry.
The law you're talking about is not in writing at this time.
No, you're right. The law is not in writing, but you do have the same author. And we went through this last week, so you can get on Facebook and watch the whole video. But we have the same author, and you do have the same author using the exact same word and the same language. And really, you think the other options are that he did something to his father, which there's a lot of holes in that argument. Or the third option is that he literally just saw his nakedness, but the next verse says that Noah woke up and knew it instantly that something had happened. What happened that, if I just saw you without your clothes on and then you woke up hours later, you'd never knew I was there. So it's got to be some physical action taken. Well, we're using the Bible to define the Bible. Yeah. That's exactly what Johnny said last week. That's right. That is the problem with commentaries, isn't it? Yeah. They often do. They completely miss things. And I'll tell you, with commentaries, you have to be real careful. And this is my suggestion when you're using commentaries, and this is how I use them. I do the study for myself first. I go through and I look at the words, and I look at all of the ways that they're used throughout the Bible. I study it for myself first, and then I go back and I read the commentary to make sure I didn't miss something. But if you're starting with the commentary, you're letting somebody else who's not inspired put ideas in your head, and then you aren't thinking for yourself necessarily about it. And so commentaries are useful in a very limited sense, but I promise you, there's lots of things that are true about the Bible that no commentary says, because they just miss things a lot. Yes, ma'am, Miss Loretta?
Well, as I said last week, I never ever thought that.
Me either. No.
But when you do put the two together, there's a huge correlation that something happened other than he just saw his dad naked.
Yes, yeah. It does seem to be that there has to be more. But that being said, we can still disagree about this and all go to heaven, and so we're going to end the discussion there and move on to Job chapter 1. But that's what we talked about last week. I'm sorry if you weren't here and you didn't get the whole treatment from Johnny. It is on Facebook if you'd like to go watch it. It is kind of a difficult thing to think about, and I assume that probably none of us have heard that before Johnny mentioned it. I know I hadn't anyway, and based on what other people have told me, nobody else had. So it's a hard thing to think about, but I do think that it's the most consistent argument I've heard biblically. Job chapter 1, we are looking at Job chapter 1. We're looking at what is, to me, one of the most unique men in all of the Bible. He is not an Israelite, best we can tell, and so he is the main character of the book, but he is the only one I can really think of where the whole book is about someone who is not descended from Abraham or one of Abraham's ancestors in any possible way, best we can tell. And if he is descended from Abraham, he would be descended from Ishmael and not from Ishmael's but Isaac, not from Isaac, if he's descended from Abraham at all. And so he's a very unique individual, and he's also given a very high praise from God. We talked about from 1 Peter this morning, the commendation that God gives. Job has high praise. There was a man, verse 1, in the land of Uz, whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright and one who feared God and shunned evil. And so, I mean, that's a dream, right? For God to say that about you, about me. I mean, I could only wish that God could say that about me. But Job is he's not perfect, but he is a tremendous person. And so it says here that he's blameless. Now that is literally the idea of he's very mature and that he's not tarnished by sin, which is not to say that he's perfect. We see in just a few verses, he makes sacrifices and offerings to God for sins. But in this instance, not his, but assuming that he would make them for him in the case of his sins. Romans chapter 3 tells us all but Jesus have sinned, and so he must have sinned. But the idea of maturity that's not tarnished by sin is that his choices are, generally speaking, not influenced by sin. He makes choices, and he doesn't make sin a part of that decision-making, as often as he can. Just one moment, Carl. It says that he's upright, which is, some of you I know have told me you have it. You know what scoliosis is? Kind of like a crooked back. Well, that comes from the Greek word scolios, which just means crooked. This is the Hebrew word that corresponds with the Greek word straight back. And so that's kind of a crooked back, when it's not literal, metaphorically, is someone who does crooked things. An upright person is someone with a very straight, they hold their posture correctly, spiritually speaking, and therefore they do what is right. They hold themselves to a standard of straight, if you bend over and slouch a lot, you're not following the standard of good posture. Spiritually, he had good posture. His standard was with God's. It says he fears God, which is the idea that just like kids learn to do with their parents. He learns to trust God, and that when God says something positive, he believes it. And when God says something negative, he believes that too. And then he shuns evil, which is the idea that he turns aside. It's literally, he turns away. He turns his face from evil. It's reminiscent of what it says about Cain, that God turned his face from Cain's sacrifice because it wasn't righteous, it was sinful. Job follows God in that. I think about Job 31 and verse 1. And Job, as an example of this, Job 31 and verse 1, he says, I have made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I look upon a young woman? And so it's the idea, if he sees a young woman and he feels the urge to take the second glance, the inappropriate second glance, he's made a promise to himself, a covenant that he turns his head away. That's literally what the idea of shunned evil is. That when he comes to sin, he just turns completely away from it, so that he's going further from sin instead of closer to it, which I think is very instructive in how you become a person like Job. And it says that he's from the land of Uz. Now, Uz is mentioned 2 other times in the Bible. Once in Lamentation chapter 4 and verse 21. Lamentation 4:21 mentions Uz. And then once in Jeremiah 25, verses 20 and 21. Jeremiah 25, 20 and 21 are the only other instances of Uz. And they tend to locate Uz in a group of nations that are in the southern part of Israel. So you're thinking down, if you have Israel here, you have how the Jordan River runs next to it. And then how there's the Dead Sea at the bottom where we assume Sodom and Gomorrah was close to. It's that area there over to the Mediterranean. Somewhere in there is what they're calling Uz. And so he lived very close to where Abraham lived. He probably lived just shortly after the time of Abraham based on the places that his friends are from. But he himself doesn't seem to be related in Abraham. And it says in verse 3 that all his possessions, this man was the greatest of all the peoples of the East. If he was alive at the same time as Abraham, even Abraham wasn't as rich as he was. The most wealthy, most maybe well-known person in all of the East, all that area. Okay, Carl, were you going to say something?
Well, you mentioned it, but I've heard several times, and it may be wrong. I don't know, but a lot of I do know some of the scholars think that he lived way before Abraham.
And there is that potential that some people say he's really, other than maybe Adam and Eve and the people before the flood, that he is the oldest, well, not oldest in age, but oldest as far as when he lived, person in all of history. The only trouble I have with that, and I think it's possible, is chapter 2 and verse 11 when it describes who his friends are. And it says, Eliphaz the Temanite, and Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, and those 3 people, those names are names of people who didn't exist until Abraham's time. And that's the primary reason why I tend to think that he is not quite that early in history. He's closer to Abraham's time. But it's really hard to place Job in history. And along with that, it's kind of curious. We'll talk about this more in a moment. But even some of the words, we mentioned Uz. Now, I mentioned that Uz is only mentioned in Jeremiah and Lamentations. Well, Jeremiah wrote both of those books. And Jeremiah is not alive until just before the fall of Israel. And then along with that, when it says the word Satan there, you remember, the book of Genesis never uses the word Satan. It calls him a serpent and never mentions him again in Genesis. The word Satan doesn't show up until, biblically speaking, until the time of Ezra. He's really, that time period is the first time that any of the Jews are using that word in this way about Satan himself. Sometimes the word adversary is used in other places in the Bible, not talking about Satan, but as far as talking about some kind of spiritual being who is tempting us and so forth and so on, it's not used until the time of Ezra, who's one of the very last people to ever live in the Old Testament. And so it's, then the question becomes, well, is he not alive until the time of Jeremiah and Ezra, or are they just kind of drawing on his language from Job for a particular reason much later than he was? It's very hard to place Job's life in history, but it's possible, Carl, yes, that he was alive then.
You think Uz maybe was a small area is the reason it wasn't mentioned many times?
it could be a small area, or it could be a general name for the whole area, and that's possible too. And it may be that it wasn't called that until the time of Jeremiah, and it could be that he lived, during Abraham's time, but it wasn't recorded by inspiration until later in history. It's hard to say for sure. Genesis is written by Moses, but Moses was not alive for any of those events. He wrote that by inspiration, hundreds of years later. So it's possible that Job could be the same way. Yes, ma'am.
And isn't it something that he was such a good man, because usually people that have that much wealth
Yes.
usually have power too,
Yes.
and that he was so good.
Yes. That's part of what makes him so exceptional. Is you think he is the perfect example of 1 Timothy chapter 6. And we're in 1 Timothy 6, Paul writes about wealth, and he says, the love of money is the root of all evil, but money itself is not evil. And so he gives a lot of instructions in 1 Timothy 6 to the wealthy and says, if you happen to be wealthy, that is a blessing from God. And so you use that for God's glory, you use that for God's kingdom. And he even says that there's nothing wrong with enjoying your wealth a little bit. And that you don't have to live an impoverished lifestyle and give it all away, but that there's a balance between enjoying it and using it for God's glory. And that really what he's saying is, even the idea of enjoying your possessions is, if used appropriately, a part of God's plan and then a part of God's glory. And so Job is a great example. People have tried to say at different times that it's wrong to be wealthy. Job is a great example of that's not true. It's more about, do you desire wealth? The wealthiest man in the world could still be covetous because he desires more than he has. The poorest man in the world could be the same because he desires more. It's really about your heart more than about how much money you have. Yes?
What really set Job apart at this point in the scripture is the fact that he lost his family and still didn't curse God.
Yes, and so you've got the wealth.
That would be the hard thing.
The hardest part is, and that's, we'll look at that in a moment, but how close it hits to home. And that's talking about his wealth, just as a comparison point. For this time period, typically, a herd of, say, camels or sheep, the biggest that they normally had was 300. And it says here in verse 3 that, he had 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels. Now, it's not unheard of. Even, y'all know the ancient writer Aristotle. He records someone from this region, or people from this region, from the Middle East region, that had 3,000 camels. And so it's not impossible. It certainly did happen. But it is, compared to the average, it is exponentially more. And probably they were nomads. Job probably moved all around the region because the land just wouldn't support that many animals unless you moved a lot. And so you kind of get a sense of what Job's life was like. He's got all of this wealth, and he moves from place to place, season per season. Yes, sir?
One of the things that I guess dumbfounds me here is that he was not caught up in the current religion. That's
Yes.
what kind of makes me think that it had to be before
I see.
Abraham, because the entire religion was in that area was
Yeah.
paganism. And then you have this one man who is extraordinarily wealthy, who
And
is
so devout.
monotheistic
Yes.
and
Yeah.
praying to God.
Right. And that's,
So it just doesn't fit.
I think it's possible it doesn't fit, but I also like to think of it from this perspective. When you look back even on church history, there are often pockets of time where you can't find the church in the records. And there was a man who wrote a book, it's called Traces of the Kingdom, and it's about the Church of Christ. But he went back and he dug very carefully in the from like 1,000 to now English in London and that area, and he found little clues and then wrote a book about it, that the church did exist. Now they weren't well known, not well enough to like get in the history books, but they did exist. And so you have, even in this time period, perhaps Carl is right that he's older than that, but I think it may be an example of that same concept of just because history doesn't necessarily record our existence, doesn't mean there aren't people who are faithful to God. Abraham was a pagan, and he's called out of paganism, and he obeys. Perhaps Job was, and we looked at that a while back, part of what made Abraham, part of why God called him is, when he started off, he really was kind of a nobody. And that was kind of God's way, wasn't it? He told the children of Israel, you're the smallest, you're a nobody. So if he calls Job to be, the seed, the heir, then he's called the greatest man in the world. Well, people expect that, but that's not how God usually operates. But it doesn't mean Abraham was the only person who believed in God at this time. Yes?
Melchizedek.
And Melchizedek, he's another example of, during Abraham's time, somebody who was faithful to God, and we assume probably only God, even though most people around him were pagans. And so that's a good point. And then he says, you kind of have this situation here. This is the place he is. Verse 2 says he has 7 sons and 3 daughters. That's 10 children. That's really the idea. It could be literal, or it could just be 10 is the number of many. He had many children. And you think it's kind of interesting. 7, remember from our Daniel class, tends to be the number of God's complete will. He had as many sons as God intended to give him. 3 is the number of strength. Even his daughters represent how strong he was and how much he had and how faithful his family was. And then we talked about his possessions. In verses 4 and 5, you have that he is a righteous leader in his family. He's very concerned at the end of verse 5 that the sons might sin and curse God. And curse God, it could mean like a literal, like, I hate you, God, kind of thing. The word could mean just to neglect God. He's just concerned that they've forgotten to say their prayer, forgotten to be faithful, that they're just not doing all that they should. And so it could be a very like direct kind of apostasy, or it could be just a sort of, we just got too caught up in the things of life and forgot to pay attention to God. Job is very concerned about both of those things as he is living his life for his family. Remember, he's a patriarch, and so whether he lived before Abraham or after Abraham, because he's not a Jew, that means he is the spiritual head of his family. That's how God communicated. He communicated through the oldest father through this time period. And so he's the spiritual head of his family. He's the priest of his family at this time. Now, as we get into verses 6 through 12, you get verses 1 through 5 give us kind of the setting. Verses 6 through 12 give us the circumstance that makes the story relevant to us. And it says, there was a day, verse 6, when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. Now, when we're talking about sons of God, I want to just think about the context for just a minute and what we're looking at here. He's been describing Job, a very faithful person to God. And then he transitions to describe that these people, these beings whom he's called the sons of God, have come before him. And I think probably you know of a situation that's just like this because we did it an hour ago. The Bible describes us as the children, the sons of God, and we come before God in worship. And so I think in context, it really makes more sense to say that what's happening is the people who are faithful to God, Job and whoever else is in that region who's faithful to God, they have come together on some appointed day to worship. And you have a worship assembly with just regular human beings, Job being one of them. And part of the reason why I say this is, think about what they're talking about. God and Satan are having this conversation as people are worshiping God, and God is looking out over the crowd and saying, among all of these people, look who the standout is. And that means that Satan is not in God's throne room where angels are, because that's really hard to correlate biblically, isn't it? How can Satan go to God's throne room? So Satan is on the earth where the humans are as they worship God. And so it keeps Satan out of God's throne room, and it keeps everything within the context of what the book of Job is talking about so far. And so much so that as they worship, it seems that God and Satan are discussing the worshipers during their worship service through this story. Any thoughts or comments about that?
So you're saying, just for clarity, that this is the first mention of Satan being called Satan rather than a serpent, or?
Yes, at least if you're going from Genesis to Job, it's in 2 Chronicles, but that was written probably after Job.
Okay.
And so, chronologically, and it's one of the few times that he's called Satan in the Old Testament. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I have a footnote here that says, the translation is angels, but then it says footnote, sons of God.
Yeah. So that is a common way that people think of it. It literally in the Hebrew says sons of God. It doesn't say humans or angels. The ancient Jews thought of them as angels, and that's why people today tend to think of them as angels. And if you think that's angels, I won't argue with you about it. But I'm just trying to keep us in context as to what we're talking about. It really makes more sense if you follow the train of logic that he's giving and keep it in context. In the same way that we talked about Genesis chapter 6, you've got these two families. And when it says the sons of God, it's not talking about some kind of strange angels who we know it's physically impossible for them to marry. Jesus says that. It's talking about the righteous people versus the daughters of men, the unrighteous people, Cain's family versus Seth's family. You really have the same language being used here. Here are these righteous people coming to worship God. And God and Satan look out over them in this sort of story form, saying, look at all these righteous people. And God says, well, what about Job? He's something special, isn't he?
Here's another verse that
Okay.
that I don't know. It tends to, it says, have you considered Job? There is no one on earth like him.
Yes.
So you would think that if he lived during the time of the patriarchs, that statement wouldn't be the case.
Well, I don't know, because Abraham had a lot of troubles, didn't he? His faith was very weak. It was, and he grew a lot. Just because Abraham is the one God chose to be the seed does not mean he was the most righteous person on earth. In fact, we really know he wasn't. He worshipped the moon god when he was called. And
well, that I know. That what
yeah.
I'm saying is that I just find, I find it, however the situation is,
yeah.
whenever, what time that he lived in,
yes.
I find it that God saw him at that particular time, wherever time that is,
yes.
that God saw him as the best of the best
yeah.
at that time.
That he was very faithful. Yeah, he's the example that others should be. Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. And their day would imitate Job as he imitates God. And so he is the example that anyone should be happy to follow. And so you have the sons of God who are presenting themselves. You have Satan who's walking on the earth. You have Job who is on the earth. And even the word Satan there, it doesn't say Satan in the text. It says the adversary is what that's Satan is a transliteration, and so it says the adversary, the one who accuses people of deserving punishment, deserving hell, however you want to think of that. He's the one that's there with the Lord, and he's the one that is accusing Job of being faithful for shallow reasons. Well, Job is only faithful because look at no one has what he has. If I had all that, I'd be faithful too, which, as we pointed out earlier, is not really true, is it? It tends to be that the wealthiest people tend to get caught up in that, and that's what Jesus says. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for the wealthy to go to heaven, which doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means there comes a lot of blessing with riches, and there comes a lot of temptation. And so really what Satan is saying here is not true, but it does sound convincing, doesn't it? Well, if you bless me that much, I'd be faithful too. In the same way that people said, well, if God just spoke to me today, or if I could see a miracle, I'd believe in God. Well, the people who could see miracles didn't believe in God sometimes. The people who walked with God in the wilderness for 40 years, they knew he was real, but they weren't faithful, were they? And so, those all sound like good excuses, and that's what Satan is using here. In the same way that, perhaps in the garden, it's just a little switch of one word, he did not say, and suddenly we've got all of these problems that come with it. Satan is he's very good at that. Now, what I think is interesting here about verses 7 and 8 is you get some of the characteristics of these two. Satan, we're told, he goes to and from on the earth, from walking back and forth on it. And so Satan is depicted in this story as somebody who is limited, right? He's not God. He's limited. And he's just kind of going here and wandering almost aimlessly, it would seem, just kind of looking out for somebody that he can condemn, that he can accuse in some way. Versus verse 8, when you have God telling us the characteristics that he cares about, which then tells us about God's characteristics himself. He's the one who is blameless and upright and who should be feared. And God shuns evil. Miss Loretta.
So my mind just went stuff like this.
Okay.
We're in Genesis in the garden.
Yes.
He appears to be a serpent, slithering around through the trees, whatever.
Whatever, yeah.
Now he's walking on the earth.
Right.
How do we do that?
Yeah, and that's, I believe here that that he's not being seen by people, right? This is description. It's a general description of what Satan does, but we're not to take it too literally as far as he's not on legs necessarily.
He's not literally walking.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
But he is limited. He's spirit, kind of like God is, but he's limited in the same way that angels are spirits, but they don't have all the power that God does. Angels go to and fro, and they are not everywhere at one time, and they can't just show up whenever they want to. They have to, in a sense, travel, and that's how we're depicted here with Satan. That the point is not necessarily about actual travel. The point is Satan is not everywhere tempting everyone at one time. Satan is there, and then he's in China once he gets there. And then he's in the UK, and today he showed up where Job is worshiping, because Job is, the best known, most wealthiest person on earth. And so if you can bring Job down, a lot of people are going to go down with him, right, Carl?
I was going to say the word adversary
Yes.
is a legal term.
It is, yes.
And that means prosecutor.
Yes.
And so but also at that particular time, laws were not written down, and so laws were vague. And so if you could use examples.
Okay.
So
You mean precedence is not written down?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So you use the examples and so on and so forth, and so you would use an example. This guy did this, and this guy did this, and this guy did this. So here is why this is wrong. Here's why the law, he broke the law, because the laws were not necessarily they weren't necessarily clear to everybody, and so sometimes you had to go and do this and so on and so forth, and that's what a adversary would do.
Yes.
Choose.
So what he's talking about is there was
these
a
type of people.
position in the king's court in most countries at the time who was called the adversary. He was hired by the king to look for people in his kingdom who were disloyal to the king, and then come and accuse him so that the king could root out people who were maybe planning, some kind of rebellion or something. That was an official job that people had, and that's another reason why part of me leans toward making Job take place or be written very late by someone like Ezra, because you read the things that Ezra wrote. They're very legal, aren't they? He was a scribe in the king's court. He's a very legal-minded person. This is a lot of legal language, but we can't say that for certain. At any rate, so 7 and 8 give us a contrast of Job and Satan, or of God and Satan. Verses 9 through 12 give us, or 9 through 11 anyway, give us sort of the purpose of man in relation to the aspects of God and Satan. So Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for nothing?" And this is the argument, that you've made a hedge around him. He's too blessed to sin, which is ridiculous, but that's what he says. And so verse 11, "Stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." And so you get in here, if God is this and Satan is this, what is man? Just like we talked about this morning, man is here for God's glory, so that when Satan accuses us, we triumph and show that God's way is always better. And that's our purpose. That's Job's purpose. That's our purpose. And so verse 12, the Lord allows this to take place because that's the purpose really that we were created for. You think they're put in the Garden of Eden. Their purpose, once Satan shows up, is to show that God's way is best and to put Satan to shame. Now they fail, but that's what they should have done. And that's what we are still trying to overcome and still trying to do, is show the glory of God. We choose his way willingly. We want to, because we see that his way is best. And that's one of the great things of Job, is he does that very successfully. He brings God glory because he knows that even in the worst of circumstances, God's way are always best. So he continues in verse 13, and he talks about, here's his most prized possession, not possession, but his greatest treasure, his sons and daughters, and they're all together. So he's introducing, the stress of the story. This is, if you watch movies where it's, like you see a whole bunch of people come together, and someone's planning to blow up the building or whatever, and they show all the scenes of people coming together and laughing, and they have no idea, but you're sitting there sweating. Are they going to stop the bomb in time or not? That's what he's introduced in verse 13. And so he takes out in verse 14 and 15 his working animals. In verse 16, he takes out his supply of wool that he can make clothes and blankets and such with. In verse 17, he takes out his transportation, camels. In verses 18 and 19 then, the climax, he takes, as we mentioned, his greatest treasure, and the house falls in, and he loses all but his wife. And you notice through all of this, it's not just animals, but also servants. There's always just one servant that survives. I'm the only one who made it out to come and to tell you about this. And so verse 20, Job arose. And so that's, he's taking action. He's responding. He tore his robe. That represents his grief over what has happened. He shaves his head. That represents his shame. He feels shame over what has happened to him. And he fell to the ground in worship. And this is his humility. This is his response, that no matter what happens to him, God's glory is always his first and foremost priority. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, the Lord took away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And so God didn't literally do this to him, right? God allowed it, but it's Satan that does it. But Job knows who runs the universe. And so he knows if God allows it, God is going to turn it into something greater, isn't he? And that's what every bad thing that happens. Someone mentioned that to me after worship this morning, talking about if we lose our rights sometime, those bad things that happen, God turns them into something better. And so no matter what that happens, we just say, this was not my plan for today. But God's going to do something better with this than what I even had planned. Yes, ma'am.
Could you explain a little bit, and I probably should know this,
No.
this, he tore his robe?
Yes.
What was the semblance in when they did that?
Yeah, so it's they just like the tunic and the garment, they wore a lot of layers, and so that outer layer was made of probably some kind of wool or something. It's very easy. The seams would be easy to rip, and so they would grab them, and it's sort of an idea of how your heart feels when you get terrible news, just like it's ripped in half. It's that kind of symbol. It's an outward symbol of what you're feeling, so that other people can see how distressed you are. I rip this open. This is just a material thing. I don't really care about it. What I care about is what I lost. I would trade this jacket. You think David wore the finest robes of the nicest kind of material. Job probably did too, because he was so wealthy. He's a prince in his time. Even the finest robe of the nicest material, rip it open to show what's going on inside, the grief that you feel for what's happening. And then, they don't mention it here, but they will later. You put on a sackcloth, which is something itchy and uncomfortable, to show God how serious you are about wanting to make things right if you need to, or to overcome this difficulty in a faithful way, that you let your body be uncomfortable so that your spirit doesn't get comfortable in this bad situation and you remain faithful. And it ends then in verse 22, and this is God's commendation. This is the result of the test, if you want to call it that. In all this, Job did not sin nor charge God with wrong. God's glory came first. So even when Job had lost everything, and he had more to lose than any of us, he did not sin. And if he could do it with all that he had, we talked about how riches make it harder, don't they? If he could do it with all that he had, we can do it too.
Well, that's what bothers me when I hear people say, well, God was good. He wouldn't be letting all these things happen.
Yes.
He wouldn't let this be happening. And it's like they're charging God.
They are.
And that's foolish.
That's the charging is a legal term, and so that's what Satan expected Job to do, was to charge God with evil, which is really Satan's whole point, isn't he? To convince you that God's not really good, and that's what he tells that's what he tells Eve in the garden is, if God were really good, he would have given you the knowledge of good and evil automatically, but he must be evil because he didn't, and Eve is tempted. She's kind of falling into this. And so that's Satan's whole goal, is to get you to sin so that other people look at your sin and your difficulties and say, well, God really is. I mean, that person was the most devout Christian I'd ever seen. And look at what happened to them, and now they've turned away from God. God really is an evil God, isn't he? And that's what's so important about our response. We have to be people who are always ready to worship, like Job did, even in the face of the greatest challenges, because others are watching and they're saying, God is good or God is evil. That's 1 Peter, the whole point, when he says they'll praise God in the day of visitation. Matthew 5:16, let your light so shine so that they see your good works and glorify God. even just a few verses earlier, when they persecute you and revile you, all of those things, our response brings God glory, or it hides God's glory. We get to decide. All right, we will end there for today. Thank you so much for your attention and your comments. And I'm glad that we can talk about some kind of hard things sometimes together and all walk away with the right attitude. I think that's really important for a Bible class. And so thank you for that as well.